You don't have to tell a mechanic what a dead engine sounds like, and you certainly don't have to tell a farmer what a dead farm looks like. On the freezing, overcast morning of Friday, the 14th of October, 1988, a crowd of 50 hardened farmers and bank liquidators stood in a gravel yard in Black Hawk County, Iowa. These were men who had survived the absolute worst, most grinding years of the 1980s agricultural depression. They were attending a bank liquidation auction for a foreclosed 300-acre corn farm. When the auctioneer called out Lot 42, listed in the bank's printed catalog simply as contents of Barn 3 as is, a 72-year-old retired mechanic named Henry Albright raised his hand and bid exactly $10. A low, dismissive chuckle rolled through the crowd. Barn 3 was a collapsing, dangerous liability sitting on the far southern edge of the property. Its roof was visibly caving in. The windows had been boarded shut with rough-cut pine for decades, and its heavy double doors were sealed with a massive, rusted iron padlock. The men laughing at Henry weren't doing it out of pure malice. They were laughing because an old man in a frayed canvas jacket had just voluntarily handed over a $10 bill for the privilege of owning a mountain of 50-year-old pigeon droppings, rotted wood, and useless scrap iron that the bank hadn't even bothered to appraise. But their collective amusement relied on a fundamental assumption about what was actually resting in the dark behind those sealed doors. They were reasoning from the outside in. Henry Albright was reasoning from a half-century-old memory outward. To understand the finality of the crowd's judgment, you have to remember the specific, brutal realities of farm foreclosures in 1988. The bank liquidator managing this auction, a man named Caldwell, was tasked with extracting maximum capital from the property while minimizing any physical liability. Caldwell had already pulled the working equipment, a late 70s International Harvester combine, 3 functional John Deere tractors, and the grain wagons out onto the main gravel lot to be auctioned for tens of thousands of dollars. But Barn 3 was a problem. The structure was leaning dangerously on its limestone foundation. Sending a crew inside to catalog the contents was deemed a severe safety risk, and paying a commercial demolition company to tear it down safely would cost the bank nearly $4,000. Caldwell's logic was ruthlessly efficient. If the bankrupt family had anything of value left inside that decaying structure, they would have dragged it out and sold it years ago to stave off the foreclosure. Whatever was left behind, the padlock was undoubtedly junk. So he added an as-is, unseen lot to the ledger, hoping some local scrapper would hand over a few dollars for the right to haul away the rusted metal. He thought he was outsmarting the burden of demolition. He was wrong, because this story isn't really about a $10 auction bid. It is about a piece of mechanical history that the agricultural world desperately wanted to forget, and one man who refused to let it go. In the late 1930s, Henry Albright wasn't an old man standing in a gravel yard. He was a 22-year-old lead mechanic at the only Minneapolis Moline tractor dealership in the county. At that exact time, the Minneapolis Moline Company had decided to do something incredibly audacious. They designed a machine called the UDLX Comfort Tractor. It was a mechanical anomaly. They took a heavy-duty 46-horsepower farming tractor and fitted it with a fully enclosed steel cab. They added real safety glass windows, a passenger seat, a heater, a rear-view mirror, a cigarette lighter, and a dashboard radio. Most astonishingly, they geared the transmission so the heavy machine could hit 40 miles per hour on the county roads. The marketing concept was revolutionary. A farmer could plow his fields in the morning, wash the mud off the tires, and drive his family into town for dinner in the evening using the exact same vehicle. It was a catastrophic commercial failure. At a retail price of nearly $2,000, double the cost of a standard open-air tractor, it was deemed an absurd, ostentatious luxury during the lingering, bitter shadows of the Great Depression. The farmers violently rejected it. They thought the enclosed cab made a man look soft. The company produced barely 150 units before shutting down production in embarrassment. Most of them sat rusting behind dealerships, unsellable and widely mocked. But Henry remembered one specific UDLX. In the late autumn of 1939, a fiercely independent and relatively wealthy local farmer named Elias Thorne had walked into Henry's dealership and paid cash for a bright Prairie Gold UDLX comfort tractor. Thorne didn't care that his neighbors laughed at the enclosed cab. He loved the engineering. Henry had personally prepped the machine, greasing the bearings and tuning the engine to a perfect low idle before Elias drove it away. But Elias only used the tractor for 2 seasons. When the United States entered the Second World War in 1941, Elias enlisted. Before he left, he didn't sell his equipment. He drove the heavy Minneapolis Moline UDLX deep into the back corner of his sprawling property, parked it inside Barn 3, drained the fuel lines, covered the machine with heavy canvas tarps, and secured the massive doors with a forged iron padlock. He told his family not to touch it until he returned. Elias Thorne never returned from Europe. His family, heartbroken and unwilling to deal with the machine that reminded them of him, simply left the barn locked. As decades passed, the farm changed hands, the family lines faded, and the physical structure of Barn 3 slowly began to buckle under the weight of Iowa winters. The new owners assumed it was just a shed full of useless pre-war junk. The bank liquidators in 1988 assumed the exact same thing. But Henry Albright had never forgotten the sound of that 46-horsepower engine. He knew that under half a century of dust and decay, suspended perfectly in time, sat one of the rarest agricultural machines ever manufactured in America. After the hammer fell, the auctioneer's clerk handed Henry his carbon copy receipt. Caldwell, the bank liquidator, wanted the lot cleared immediately so they could finalize the paperwork. He walked over to the sagging barn carrying a pair of heavy 36-inch steel bolt cutters. The crowd followed closely behind, driven by a mild, cynical curiosity to see exactly what kind of garbage the old man had just bought for $10. Caldwell set the hardened jaws of the cutters against the thick steel shackle of the rusted iron padlock. It took 2 strong, aggressive attempts to snap the thick metal. The lock broke and fell into the tall weeds with a heavy thud. Caldwell grabbed the iron handles of the double doors. They had settled deep into the earth over 5 decades, frozen in the hardened Iowa dirt. It took 3 younger farmers stepping up to help, putting their heavy canvas shoulders against the rotting wood to finally force the doors backward. The wood scraped aggressively across the gravel, tearing a deep groove into the earth, and swung wide. The harsh, flat, gray daylight of 1988 pierced the interior of Barn 3 for the first time since 1941. The air inside was thick with the suffocating, ancient smell of dry rot, mice, and dust. The crowd peered into the gloom, fully expecting to see a collapsed roof section trapping rusted plows and ruined lumber. Instead, sitting dead center on a raised platform of thick, custom-cut oak planks, was a massive, unnatural shape, draped entirely in heavy, olive-drab canvas tarps. The tarps were caked in decades of white pigeon droppings and thick gray dust, but the unmistakable, towering silhouette beneath them did not belong to a plow or a grain wagon or a pile of scrap. It was the massive, enclosed, squared-off profile of a cab tractor. Henry Albright walked past the bank liquidator. He didn't hurry. He stepped onto the dirt floor of the barn, walked up to the raised oak platform, and reached out to the edge of the heavy canvas tarp. The fabric was stiff, almost completely rigid from 50 years of accumulated dust and changing humidity. With a sharp, deliberate pull, Henry threw the tarp backward. A collective, stunned gasp left the lungs of 50 men simultaneously. The gray, miserable crisis of the 1980s seemed to instantly vanish in the sudden, blinding reflection of perfect, untouched Prairie Gold. The 1938 Minneapolis Moline UDLX comfort tractor sat exactly where Elias Thorne had parked it before shipping off to war. Because Elias had parked it on elevated oak planks, the heavy rubber tires had not rotted into the damp earth. Because the barn was largely sealed, no direct ultraviolet sunlight had ever touched the paint. The original factory safety glass of the enclosed cab was entirely intact, coated only in a fine film of dust. Through the driver's window, the chrome dashboard radio and the passenger seat were perfectly visible. The collapsing, dangerous, rotting structure of Barn 3 hadn't been a damp tomb. It had been a climate-controlled time capsule. The bank liquidator stared at the machine, his face rapidly draining of color. He was an educated financial officer. He kept up with auction records. He knew exactly what a UDLX was worth to the burgeoning antique tractor collector market. He had just legally sold one of the rarest production tractors in American history for a $10 bill. Caldwell took a step forward into the barn, his voice suddenly sharp and panicked. He pointed at the UDLX and tried to argue that a vehicle of that magnitude was not technically part of the contents of the barn and therefore shouldn't be included in the $10 lot. He was desperate to reverse the transaction. But the auctioneer, a local man who respected the absolute legal sanctity of a signed sale bill, simply shook his head. He pointed a leather-gloved finger to the carbon copy receipt, still in Henry's hand. It read, "Contents of Barn 3, as is. The law was the law." The bank had written the contract with that exact language to save themselves $4,000 in demolition fees. They had legally transferred ownership of everything behind the padlock to the old mechanic. Henry didn't gloat. He didn't turn around and rub his $10 receipt in the liquidator's face, and he didn't mock the farmers who had laughed at him. He simply walked to the clerk's office trailer, used the rotary phone, and called a local towing company with a heavy flatbed. But the victory of that morning had an honest limit. Henry did not just put a fresh battery in the UDLX, turn the key, and drive it out into the daylight. 50 years of absolute stillness is brutal on internal mechanical components. The massive 46 horsepower engine was completely seized. The internal cork gaskets had dried to dust. The heavy carburetor was locked solid with varnished fuel, and the massive rubber tires, while not rotted to the ground, were flat and brittle. It would take Henry 4 years of painstaking, expensive, deeply frustrating labor in his own heated shop to make that engine fire again. The $10 bid at the auction hadn't bought him a working tractor. It had simply bought him the exclusive right to save it. By the early 1990s, the collector market for vintage agricultural iron exploded. A fully restored Minneapolis Moline UDLX comfort tractor became the ultimate holy grail for museum curators and collectors, eventually crossing modern auction blocks for well over $150,000. But Henry Albright didn't sell his. He didn't save the machine from the wrecking ball just to get rich. He saved it because he remembered the young man who had proudly paid cash for it, and he remembered the day it rolled out of the dealership shining like a piece of the sun. When Henry finally passed away, the perfectly running tractor remained in his family's heated barn, a massive yellow testament to an old mechanic's impossible memory. The most reliable advantage a man can carry into a crowded room is not massive capital, and it is rarely the loudest voice. It is the quiet, unyielding patience to look at a locked door that everyone else has declared worthless and remember what it used to be.